Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to the session, The Pandemic 1 Year Later. Last year, we were about 6 months into switching to online everything, and many of us were still trying to find our way. For those that attended JAM last year, you may remember we had a panel to have a conversation about the different ways that the pandemic had impacted our institutions, both from an administrative and an academic perspective. Well, like all good movies, we decided that this topic deserved a sequel. And so to that end, I have put together a panel with some of our colleagues from the sector to have a conversation about the pandemic 1 year later. As always, we'd love to hear your reflections on the pandemic 1 year later. So please put your comments into the chat as the panelists are standing by after the airing of this session to answer your questions and respond to your comments. Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to the pandemic 1 year later. What have we learned? It's hard to believe that it has been 18 months or so since the big pivot to online everything. Being a BC Cat, while we are very tapped into institutions and what's going on in higher education, we are a smaller organization. And so our pivot to moving to online everything was relatively painless. And we've only just started our return to the office space. However, for institutions, the changes have been much more profound, with the rapid switch to online teaching for every single course, to now the return to face-to-face. And while aspects of our lives that have returned to the new normal, there are some aspects of the experience that have changed institutions for the long term. At last year's JAM, we were only 6 months into the pandemic, and institutions were still trying to catch their breath from the rapid pace of change. But now that we are a year and a half in, we wanted to revisit some of that discussion to see how things have changed, perhaps for the better. So to that end, I'd like to introduce our panel. Coming in from Fairleigh Dickinson University, I'd like to welcome Dr. James Gifford, professor at FDU. From Royal Roads University, we have Peter Dewick, Director of Admissions and Registrar. And then from VIU, we have Jean Maltison, Dean of Academic and Career Preparation. Welcome, everybody. All right, so the first question I want to ask is, now that we're 19 months into the pandemic, how have things changed for you at your institution? I'm going to start with you, Jean.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, the pandemic's really opened our eyes to some of the things that we need to do differently, for sure. Of course, the name of the day was the pivot, or the word of the day was pivot, into a different kind of delivery in our courses and our services, I think, at all our institutions. Of course, my area is developmental education, so we saw quite a change in terms of who was impacted by the new models. Students at the higher levels of developmental education transitioning into the university seem to be okay in the online world, but the lower levels struggled a little bit. But what we're seeing today is that we have a broader reach with online delivery models, and we're able to support students differently and with different hours, for example, broadening the services, as well as reach in terms of reaching into some of those communities that don't have campuses in their communities, so they can tap into education through online kinds of activities and offerings. And we're also offering blended. So I think what's happened in terms of the pandemic is we're offering more kinds of delivery models, as well as more hours of services, and really trying to reach the demand of students.
Right, and James, from your perspective, how do you think things have changed? How has the pandemic changed your institution?
In terms of the actual changes, again, we're trying to meet the demand. So what we're seeing is students are wanting different kinds of models, and so we're training instructors to deal with that demand. And I know I don't want to use the word customer, because students aren't really customers, but they kind of are. They're demanding what they're demanding for our services and our courses. So we're trying to make sure that we're reaching that demand by offering different kinds of delivery, whether it's high flex, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's online, trying to adapt to the technology. It's fast-paced, it's moving quickly. So our teaching and learning centers and experts in those fields and in those areas are really trying to support our faculty. We're also dealing with assessment assessments. How do we do assessments online in a different way? Because, there's some challenges still around that we have not quite hammered out in terms of how we're going to do that moving forward. But I think we're just open to possibilities and listening to what students are asking for and coming together as a sector to try to figure out the best way forward. One of the other things that I just want to mention too is I think, the pandemic brought with it also online fatigue. And so again, there's a lot of students now that want face-to-face or blended options to meet the demands of their lives. So they want to meet their instructors. They want to build relationships with their instructors. They want that face-to-face camaraderie of working with other students. And we all know talking to a screen of, blacked out little boxes with names on them is hard to build those relationships. So I think new models of delivery is where it's at, and how we're going to deal with that again is training our faculty and trying to listen carefully to what students are asking for.
Right. And James at FDU, I wonder how you can how you'd like to describe how the pandemic has changed your institution.
We've been in a bit of an interesting spot being an institution in 4 different locations, 2 in the US, 1 in the UK, 1 here in Canada. So in a peculiar way, the pandemic has allowed us to bond more across campuses, a bit more strategically, and also to make our students a bit more comfortable recognizing they can approach faculty on other campuses. When we had everything running online, there was a possibility of students doing a little bit more back and forthing. In particular, students from New Jersey who want to just find out what is this Vancouver experience we keep hearing about. So that in a strange way, the pandemic made us realize some of the opportunities or possibilities that we had, but hadn't been prioritizing because it didn't seem like it was urgent in the same way. And yet at the same time, I'm constantly hearing the refrain around me, when can we finally go back to normal? And very much as Jean was saying, part of that normal is recognizing that what was normal wasn't necessarily working for everybody before. It wasn't necessarily accessible. It wasn't necessarily fulfilling the potential and possibilities that were there. So I think now dealing with that added layer when some of the anxieties of the early days of the pandemic are past us is opening up what will be the next step in this process.
All right. And then looking over to you, Peter, I mean, Royal Roads is a unique institution in that the bulk of your courses are offered in online and in blended format. I mean, for you, was the pandemic just business as usual?
Yes, would it were so. No, not quite. I was actually going to start by saying that I'm betting that a lot of the people in our audience would think that we're mostly online. And, there is some truth to that. But in fact, if you look at our program delivery as opposed to our course delivery, it's less than 20% that's completely online. So we do offer programs that are totally online. We have another 20% or so that are completely face-to-face, and that's been a relatively recent change, let's say over the last 10 years. And then beyond that, we have about 65% of our programming, about 2/3, that's what we call blended. And many of you probably know about that. It means that most of those students take most of their courses online, but they always anchor that experience with an on-campus experience that might be 1, 2, or 3 weeks long, once, twice, or 3 times during the course of their program. And those experiences are called residencies or academic intensives. And of course, what we had to do during the pandemic was we had to move those residencies online, which becomes an immediate misnomer, of course. But it turns out that the students, we accepted the challenge and tried to create something of a similar experience online, which was difficult, as you can imagine. But the students really appreciated it, and it was really quite remarkable. Many of those students are now asking us to continue doing that in some of our programs. So that's one of the changes, I guess, and maybe one of the more significant changes. Number 2, I'm reminded of a comment by Sophia Palahiki, who's a co-director of our Center of Teaching and Educational Technologies, CTET. And she said, just very recently to our academic program leaders, design all of your course offerings for online delivery, please, even the ones you're planning to deliver on campus. It's much easier to pivot from online to on campus than it is to the other way around. And that may be something that's going to influence the way we handle our curriculum development and our work on curriculum committee and so on. And then lastly, I mention this just because it's perhaps a bit of an annoyance. For us, I think we've become a little more sensitive, let's say, to risk and liability in a way that makes our lives a little less fun.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? What seems to have happened, I mean, what we did is we had weekly meetings for the longest time with our emergency operations committee with, many people attending those meetings. They varied through the course of the last 18 months. For a while we had them less often than once a week. But the focus was so much on operations. The focus was so much on how to mitigate risk, for good reasons, clearly. But it seems that the need for control in our environment is becoming a more pressing need. And some of that is very understandable, but it changes the way we think about how we deliver programming on campus. I think we all agree that it's just a little less fun than it used to be from that perspective. All right, thanks for that. I'm going to turn this question over to you, Gene. As part of the pandemic, I think, obviously we learned a lot about ourselves as a result to this overall experience. But I think we've also learned a lot about the organizations in which we work. And I'm wondering if you could maybe reflect on what have you learned about your institution as a result of its response to the pandemic?
Well, I think at Vancouver Island University, everybody sort of put their shoulder to the grindstone and worked together. It put the institution into a place where we were required to work together, but it seemed fairly easy to do that in that people wanted to come together and they wanted to support one another and they wanted to think about what the students needed. And so I think, I think sometimes in a crisis, that's sort of what happens is everybody bonds. I know that was the term that James used. We bonded. We also have campuses that are located in other communities, and we were working across the campuses much better, better outreach, better collaboration, better camaraderie. And, like Peter, we also had our operations and risk management team. We had an academic continuity team. We just built all these teams at the drop of a hat, and everybody came together to try to manage the storm. It wasn't lock ourselves down and go and hide until it's over. It was like, okay, somebody's got to get out there and get that sail up, and somebody's got to get out there and steer the rudder. And, and everybody just picked up, and it was amazing to be part of that camaraderie and that collaboration. And it didn't matter what part of the institution you worked in, whether, like I said, whether you're in a service part, whether you're in an academic teaching part, whether you're in a support to the academic faculty, everybody was just on the ground. Now let's go and let's work towards finding solutions to our challenges. And that was pretty amazing. It really gave me, warmed my heart to know that I worked at an institution that had people and place and students all front and center and just working really hard to solve the challenges we were faced with.
Right. James, how about from your perspective at FDU, was there anything that you learned about your institution as a result of its response to the pandemic?
I think faculty at every institution have learned a lot about our schools during this process. In a weird way, I was on sabbatical when the pandemic began, and there was a lot of administrative change afoot. We were doing some program mergers and things to create unity across the campuses, and faculty had been, I think, resisting that, feeling like, we shouldn't be bundled in together in quite those ways. And then suddenly those things we've been resisting became lifelines to us. And in some respects, because the nature of the campus is being dispersed as they are, some of those tensions among faculty, like our university provost saying, like, I'm by Central Park and there are trucks there, dealing with the situation in New York, which is very bad in comparison to here in BC. I think we discovered a level of care that we might not have had foregrounded the same way previously, because we've always been an institution that feel like, how do we make sure that our students get what they need? How do we care for them? How do we put them as the priority? And then asking ourselves, okay, we need to do that now, and we have to do it in a different way, and we have to get it right. And caring for each other became part of that. So I think we discovered that the collaboration could be done in ways and more extensively than we had really envisioned up until that point.
Right. That's really excellent, James. Thanks for that comment. I have a friend of mine who works in the business realm, and he would often say to me, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so on that note, I'm going to turn this question over to you, Peter. Were there any opportunities that arose as a result of the pandemic that Royal Roads was able to take advantage of? You already mentioned the pivot to moving the residencies online and how that actually was more warmly received than you might have expected. But were there any other opportunities that you think might have arisen as a result of the pandemic that you were able to take advantage of?
Well, yes. I mean, if I take a step back and think about this a little more generally, it doesn't escape my imagination that it's likely that the people in Canada will be more open to an online learning experience because we are, all of us, getting to be much more comfortable about the online experience. We've done it with our friends, we've done it with our family, we've done it in meetings. Yes, it's getting a little tedious sometimes, but we're actually getting pretty good at it too, and we're getting comfortable with many different platforms. So, in very general terms, that could be very good for Royal Roads University. It's something we've been doing, as we all know, for about 25 years here, a little bit more, and we think we're getting pretty good at it. I think this pushed us in ways here in our course delivery that we had, that made us feel a little uncomfortable at times, but that actually helped us deliver better programming online. And I think if we have a willing audience, I'm pretty sure that doesn't include everyone. There are a lot of people who are going to be quite happy to go back to just the face-to-face experience, but there are a lot of people, especially people who are wanting to fit their educational and learning experiences around their jobs and family responsibilities and so on. And we become a pretty good option at that point.
Yeah. Right. How about you, Jean? Were there any opportunities that arose as a result of the pandemic that VIU was able to take advantage of?
Yes, thanks, Michael. Absolutely. I agree with everything that Peter said around, opportunities that Royal Roads experienced. And I'd also like to add to that, some students would not normally have been able to access online learning, given their socioeconomic status. If if they don't have money to buy technology or online, whether it's Wi-Fi or whatever that's related to the technology. And I know that the Ministry of Advanced Education they increased their adult upgrading grant by adding an additional $500 for students to access technology. So whether they're going to purchase a laptop or a tablet or something, even bandwidth, right, from wherever they were living. And that, I think that's going to continue. And at the lower levels, like I said, we saw a real hit to the lower students who had lower levels of education. They couldn't necessarily access the institution because we moved from face to face to completely online, and they were kind of left in the lurch with nothing. And so with this adult upgrading grant that the ministry is offering, and it looks like it's going to be ongoing, we can help students with their technology skills. And that is so important in the 21st century. So, that's helpful for us. And also, as Peter suggested, it's around faculty. I've been a believer of online education for a long, long time. I offered courses online as far back as 2006 I used a program called Breeze, which was sort of like Zoom, where you can record, you can share your screen, archive the recording. It's the same features, and it was free. And that was a long time ago. And online's not for everybody, but it's certainly for some. And it helps with people's lives. We work with adult students, and they have families, and they have work, and they have other commitments. And so, I think our institution, like Peter's and James, we're recognizing those needs much more and trying to find ways to accommodate the students. And so, I think the pandemic was an opportunity to see that and to respond immediately, but now carry that out in some kind of ongoing way to better support our students and their needs. So yeah, I think it's been good. And, just to add to that, faculty as well, I had faculty who were not believers in technology. They like the technology for computers, whether you're projecting something on the screen, a video or whatever, but in terms of online education, not really believers. And they were sort of forced to experience it. And I think some of them have changed their minds dramatically about what's possible in the world of online education. So, and blended education. And I think that's a really good thing.
We're gonna come back to that particular topic with regards to technology in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, James, at FDU, how do you feel about the overall student experience? What about the students?
That's been an interesting shift. I mean, I've been involved in distance education for a long time, and we're not a distance education school. We've always had some online courses, and I've been teaching those for FDU for more than a decade now, and used to teach for Athabasca and so forth, and took my first distance education in high school for calculus in 1991. And part of the transition here has been, like even in a professional interview, we have to follow the rule that if an animal presents themselves, they must be introduced. It personalizes part of the education experience in ways I don't think we'd anticipated. I know my students are probably asking, is that a Lego train on his bookcase behind him? Is that a Winnie the Pooh house? Who would have built that? Maybe he has kids. And that's a kind of personal connection that's a possibility for broaching conversations with students, making them feel like they can access their professors, that is different from seeing them in a purely on-campus environment. Part of what we had to do to reevaluate was stand back and say, well, okay, it's not simply technological. We've been using video conferencing between campuses for ages. But how do we actually make this work? And not just effective for students, but then what does this do in terms of course offerings, course design, and the things that we can do to make that more effective, especially for us to build camaraderie among students who are not necessarily in the same place, so they can feel that sense of connection with each other. So the one thing I'm sort of struggling with this term, or not struggling, enjoying, is teaching a methods course for our humanities majors, where I'll be teaching it for my students here in Vancouver online, but we also have students from the two New Jersey campuses joining in, and they're getting a much different sort of student population than they're accustomed to. And at the same time realizing we can collaborate with faculty across those distances and make some things happen that we hadn't done before. So that's where sort of my interest is in that at the moment.
Right. And how about you, for you, Peter, for the students at Royal Roads, how do you feel about the overall student experience as a result of everything that's happened?
Well, two quick comments. One that surprised us a bit and shouldn't have when you think about it, and that has to do with the number of enrollments we saw. We were expecting a drop in enrollment, certainly a drop in enrollment of international students, because international students have often shied away from online learning, and it's actually why we have so many face-to-face offerings now that we didn't have before. But what we noticed, and it was very obvious to us, we had a 6% increase in in domestic students, in students from Canada, during that fiscal year. And yes, we had a drop of about 7% international, but we thought it would crater, and it didn't. And then we had an overall sort of enrollment hike of about 3%. So that kind of surprised us. The other thing we did is that we surveyed students constantly. Maybe we over-surveyed them a bit, but it was kind of fun because we have all these tools, these online tools to do that. Of course, SurveyMonkey is our friend now. And you know, what we discovered, again, was that students were actually very satisfied and often quite surprised to be as satisfied as they were with the courses that we were delivering online. And that was really reassuring for our instructors and for us in general. Very pleased. And we offered many other services to students online. We've always had an online orientation, so that's there. But we also offered many counseling services online that we didn't do before. And that was much appreciated by many students. So it really worked for us.
All right. You know, when we were meeting prior to this, just as a little bit of preparation, you know, there was an interesting comment that was made with regards to the move to online, and that switching everything to online education was not as cheap as some people seem to think. And I remember early in the days of the pandemic, there was rumblings from students who were saying, well, if all my courses are online, that should be really cheap, and why am I paying the current rates for tuition fees? I wonder, Jean, if you could tell me a little bit about the resources that were necessary to navigate through this pandemic, and were they sufficient in order to properly achieve your educational aspirations?
Wow, that's a hot topic. So yeah, there were definitely costs associated with the pivot to online. So not all the instructors were set up to be able to do that. And of course, not all the students were. I already mentioned the AUG grant, and that was, you know, it was fine that students can at lower levels could purchase some of the technology, but they didn't always have the skills to use it. And that's the same with really all the faculty and staff and other employees at VIU. You know, we could purchase some things, but the learning to use it also was required. So our Center for Teaching, our Center for instruction and support for instruction and student learning was just maxed out. We saw a 600% increase in uptake on the workshops that they were providing over the usual kinds of workshops that they provide. So faculty are constantly upskilling themselves with different kinds of things, but it just demonstrated a need, and so, you know, there's time, the resources required for time of the faculty, for time of the facilitators and the leaders of those workshops, and then of course, you know, computers, cameras, you know, mice, software, all of the costs. It just added up, and really it was kind of we just had to invest. We just had no choice, right? But what it did, though, is it also required us to invest longer term. So as I mentioned, you know, we're looking at blended formats now. So classrooms are being invested in now to have cameras, microphones all over so that we can have that high flex environment, right? And so we can't switch all of our classrooms to that kind of a mechanism right away, or that delivery model right away, and nor should we. But you know, it's kind of deciding what is that mix. Is it, you know, how many should there be that are going to be in that kind of a high flex environment? How many will just be face to face? How many will be fully online? So trying to understand what that might look like and to earmark the necessary resources to invest in that it's a bit of a challenge right now, but you know, we're taking the steps we need to, and despite those costs, it's a necessary investment.
You know, James, one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking a little bit offline was around how even though there, you know, obviously we had to deliver education completely online, there was some resistance sometimes by professors who were used to an old pedagogy, and then this pivot was a challenge. I wonder if you might want to speak a little bit to that issue.
Oh, sure. It's I think anyone who is an administrative post dealing with faculty in the early days of the pandemic will have stories to tell in the future that I won't share today. But it was surprising the degree to which some faculty members across the board, regardless of age or particular discipline, had that attachment to a very specific way of doing things. And I've often, even in the midst of wanting technological innovation and lots of new tools and things for my students in my classroom, I've been a big fan of lo-fi education. How do we make these things backwards compatible? And that's been, in a sense, a pathway to understanding where some faculty have come from, where things that in the past may have been met with resistance, such as the wonderful work of BC Campus on open access teaching resources, a marvelous thing that BC is supporting and doing, and that's really getting a lot of traction around the world. Many faculty members would say, well, why would I want an open access textbook? Or if it's online and I don't have a print copy, I just don't want to deal with that. And I think necessity brought some of those hesitancies forward so they could be discussed more collegially, straight up at face value. And the results surprised people. A lot of those who were skeptical of, say, open access resources suddenly discovered the rich variety and utility of having these, and saw the responses from their students and the thank for students realizing not only is this now more accessible, customizable to me, if I have difficulty reading, I can adjust the font to something I want, I can pick it up on different devices, and I don't have to pay for it. And then the instructors are realizing, I can change it, I can customize it, I don't have to worry about a new edition next year if I don't want to use it. And not just for open resources, but for many areas, I think that demand for new responses to the circumstance led to innovation where people who simply had hesitancies discovered what the value really was in new technologies, new resources, new methods or pedagogies and approaches.
Right. Finally, over to you, Peter. Did you find that you had the resources you needed to navigate through the pandemic? And if not, what were some of the things that you found were necessary?
Well, I think the university, was quite committed to being able to balance its budget through that COVID year. That was a mandate from our board, and we took it pretty seriously. But we did hire a couple of extra people. I heard Jean's comments earlier about the CTET, our Center for Teaching and Educational Technologies. We did hire, I think, 3 people to support that work. And yes, our the usage, the number of instructors who came to use that support rose dramatically through that period, and I think that was really quite important. And we obviously saved a lot of money in many other areas. We didn't travel quite as much as we did before, and not in the same ways. So yeah, I think resources were a challenge and still are, and may continue to be for a while for us. They don't allow us to do, we have a number of classrooms here that are set up as studios. That's not surprising given how much we do online. But I think there's more of a push now, or at least people are thinking about turning many more of our classrooms into virtual studios to allow what Jean was talking about earlier, the hybrid experience, the high flex experience. So we could spend a lot more money than we have. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, I know here at BC Cat, our travel budget went pretty much completely unspent in the last year and a bit. I'm going to leave this last question. I'm going to ask you guys to put on your prognostication hats, and I'm going to start with you, Peter. This has been quite an experience, certainly nothing like I've ever experienced in my over 20 years in higher education. I'm going to ask you, what is your prediction for what higher education is going to look like 5 years from now as a result of this experience? Starting with you, Peter.
Well, I think one of the big things is that there's going to be a general understanding. It sort of refers back to something I said earlier in the population about the value of online possibilities. And I think there's going to be more of a sophisticated approach in the thinking. What I mean is, I think people will understand now, finally, that not all online teaching or learning is bad, but it's also not all good. We had good and bad experiences. And so that's a more sophisticated, more nuanced approach to online education. And people are going to be shopping when they are thinking about online education. They'll be wanting to find those programs and courses where people know how to deliver programming online. And I think all of us will get better at doing that. And I think that's a big change that will happen over the next 5 years. Associated with that, for Royal Roads, I think we're going to have a lot more competition in the next 5 years, because I think so many universities, well, all of us actually, found out that this was a kind of an interesting space to play in. And so, there will be more competition there. But I think, lastly, that I think there'll be more acceptance for what we do at Royal Roads University in terms of transfer credit and things like that. We've had some resistance over the years, people going like, oh, did you do that course online? I guess it's not quite as good as the face-to-face version. And I think some of that will disappear. Some of it won't, because some people had very bad experiences with some online deliveries. But I think in general, I think people will understand that, yes, you can actually deliver a good experience online. And I think that'll help us all.
All right. And then turning over to you, James, what's your prediction for higher education in the next 5 years?
This is where I say I'm doing research projects on speculative fiction right now. And the problem with them is that you'll end up with, a novel about people in the future who can travel between stars and have giant intergalactic space vessels, and they've never heard of something like a cell phone. So all of our prognostications, all of our thoughts about the future are given to problems for the simple reason that they're actually about the present. What I think we're going to run into in the future and really tomorrow is a recognition that whether it's going to be high flex teaching, distance education, online education, face-to-face, commuter, small tutorial groups, lecture format, whatever modality we're teaching in, as Peter said, there's good teaching and there's bad teaching. And rather than focusing on the modality, which has a lot to do with access and resources, I think we're probably going to see people giving more of their attention to good teaching and thinking of the modality second, so that we can look at a class and say, this is a well-designed class. This is a good curriculum. This is a strong instructor who's able to nurture students and foster the best outcomes possible for them. And there'll be less question of, should I plan this to be distance? Should I plan it to be online? Should I plan it to be high flex? That will become something we won't ever stop talking about and thinking about, but it won't occupy our decision making as this is the nature of that thing. So my hat for the future is that we're going to see a good deal more flexibility in moving across modalities in order to address student need and the best outcomes we can get for students.
All right, and finally over to you, Gene. What's your prediction for the next 5 years for VIU and higher education in general?
Well, that's get out my crystal ball and have a look, right? So I think both James and Peter really mentioned some really great opportunities around how technology and what the pandemic did in terms of creating those opportunities for moving forward. So, I think BC CAT will have a role to play as we move forward. The Peter mentioned it, as did James, around, whether a course is good taught online or face-to-face. I think our students are going to be more selective because there's going to be more opportunities there. Peter, you talked about competition, right? I think I'm going to reframe that more as collaboration. I think institutions will be collaborating more going into the future, only because it's not like BC has an endless pot of money to support the post-secondary sector, and we've seen that. And we're relying more and more on student tuition to help pay the bills. And so I think it's going to push us to collaborate a little bit more. BC CAT plays a huge role in that in terms of transfer, and students are going to be more selective, and that was already happening, but I think it's going to happen even more. They could be, located on Vancouver Island in the Nanaimo area, taking courses at VIU, and at the same time sitting in the library taking a course through Royal Roads, for example, right? And then they may even drive down the road to go and meet that instructor later. So I think creating ways to integrate our institutions a little bit more around the course structures that we're offering, and how those might be transferable or not. Maybe there's going to be more niches found at our institutions to make sure that we're using the instructors who are amazing in their fields to just be the experts, and we can, focus on that. It's so unclear. I just think we're going to have to be more responsive to student needs. We saw that in the pandemic, and we'll continue to see that, and we'll have to be more collaborative as a sector.
All right. Thank you for that. I really appreciate all these perspectives and answers to these questions. This was a really excellent conversation. What I'd like to do now is draw the recorded session to a close. Remind our delegates that are watching this online to put your questions and comments into the chat, because we're going to switch now over to the live portion where we will be able to build upon this conversation. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It is now my pleasure to welcome our panelists live and in the Zoom flesh. We have Jean Maltison from Vancouver Island University. James Gifford is with us from Fairleigh Dickinson University. And of course, we have Peter Duick from Royal Roads University. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We have a few minutes to chat, and we got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the second question first. This is from Lisa Middleton from the Justice Institute of British Columbia. She offers, from a student perspective, student behavior seems to have changed drastically. We aren't seeing the same face-to-face walk-ins that were normal for us. Is anyone else seeing this? So I wonder if you can reflect on whether the student interactions have changed. I'll start with you, Jean.
Yes, we are absolutely experiencing the same thing here in my location on Vancouver Island. There is an expectation, I think, for us to be available in different formats. So students are reaching out online. There are some also reaching out by phone. But even when they reach out online, they're still a little bit more reluctant to always have their camera on, even in conversations. So I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but absolutely, I would agree that they have changed in terms of how they're interacting with us and with each other too. I think there's still a lot of fear out there, and that's part of their reaction here. But yeah, we're experiencing the same thing.
James, are you finding the same thing in FDU?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe in a slightly different way. One of our things being multi-campus and crossing borders, I'm finding I get far more queries from students in New Jersey than I ever did before, because I think that electronic form of access, rather than knocking on an office door, has just become so much more normalized for them over the past little while. And perhaps, as Jean was saying, interacting to provide support for a prospective student or someone who's not, say, in your class, to give them advice, they are really reluctant to have their cameras on. I just reiterate, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think they're telling us what they're comfortable with and what they need. And as much as that is, say, a pain for me as an instructor, it's, that this is, in a sense, our new norm.
And for you, Peter, I mean, Royal Roads, the bulk of your programming is delivered largely online. So have you noticed any changes into the way that students are interacting with your institution?
Well, of course, we used to have face-to-face engagement and interactions with students in the registrar's office, in the admissions area, with enrollment services where prospects would come and ask questions. We've actually closed that building where these things happened. We've just recently reopened it, actually as recently as this week. And we are not seeing anybody come in. I'm not surprised yet. We'll see what happens over the rest of this period of time till Christmas, and then really what happens in January, I think, will be most telling, because that's when all of our face-to-face programming will, including our residencies, should be happening back on campus. So we'll see what happens then.
All right, and so we have a question here from Rob Fleming. I know who that is. He has a question about transfer credit assessment. Have transfer credit assessment and transfer admission practices and procedures changed at your campus as a result of the different approaches to assessment and grading at some schools? Are there some lessons learned that might inform ongoing procedural changes? So what has been the impact on transfer credit practices? I'll actually start with you, Peter, and we'll come back to James and then Jean.
Sure. I mean, obviously, when it comes to the concepts that we're trying to uncover at this conference, and of course what BC CAT is all about, that's a very good question. I'm probably not really representative of what has been happening in admissions offices across BC, and that's because most of our undergraduate programs are actually degree completion. So we've been taking transfer credit. Well, in a sense, all those programs rely on transfer credit for the first 2 years, and that hasn't changed at all, really. We simply look at what students have completed in their first 2 years. We had discussions about what to do with grades if they became pass-fail instead of the usual grading scales. And we just decided that we were going to go with what we saw in the transcripts, and of course, we also often rely on personal statements and so on. So we do a little bit more of a holistic admission anyway, and we were quite happy with that. Also, transfer credit into the 3rd and 4th year, and even into our master's level programs. I haven't noticed any real change there at all, except for the difficulty that students are having in getting transcripts from certain places. Certainly internationally, that's been rough. Afghanistan's been impossible, naturally, and other countries have been very difficult as well. And so we've eased up on our I don't even want to say this, but on our demand for official transcripts. We've been quite lenient there, and I'll leave it at that. But it's actually been working pretty well for us. Everyone's been trying to work to make it work, to make it happen.
All right, we can scrub that last part out of the video when we put it up to YouTube if you want. James, What about from Fairleigh Dickinson University? Has there been any impact on the transfer credit assessment practices at FDU?
I can't speak from the registrar's perspective like Peter, except to say, yes, we're all aware that there are challenges, and in specific places there are very real challenges right now. For my experience, I would say more for receiving course articulation requests. I can only repeat what I said about students wanting to reach out and getting more emails from students in different places, because they're doing online and email contact far more than in the past. My assessment of transfer credit requirements for course articulations has slowed down because the volume of email has become enormous. And I hear this from colleagues on the academic side of things, not on the administrative side, that the sheer volume of email has increased a lot over the last 2 years, and that is slowing down some of the administrative processes, such as approving course articulations and working on them. So I can only say, apologies to my colleagues around BC. We are catching up, and I will be caught up soon.
And finally, I'll turn it to you, Jean, for the final word. So has there been any impact on transfer credit assessment and practices at Vancouver Island University?
And I agree with everything that's been said so far. I can't speak on behalf of our registrar. The volume of emails has increased. I know that during the pandemic, there was a lot of research going on within our institution, reaching out to other institutions in terms of how assessments were being done in other places and how grades were being inputted. I know that there was some consideration about a CR credit given instead of a grade in some cases because of the pivot. And, when we're in doubt, we reach out to chairs at other institutions to have conversations about what actually happened. And it does require work. We're trying to be as fair as possible to students in terms of acknowledging and recognizing what they've done prior to coming to VIU. And likewise, if the students are going elsewhere, the same, we would be as transparent as possible on what they've done so that they can be assessed appropriately. BC CAD, of course, is really helpful with the transfer guide. And, it's been great having BC CATs to avoid some of this extra work. But with the pandemic, there's been a little bit more work on the front of emailing and making sure that the students are meeting the required outcomes of the courses.
All right. Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us this morning. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and I can see from the feedback in the chat, many people have enjoyed and learned a fair bit. So I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning. We will give you back the gift of time. Our next session will be beginning at 9:45, so I encourage everybody watching online. You can close the session and join us in the next room, and we will see you at 9:45. At 10:45, when Fiona McQuarrie will be giving us a presentation on reverse transfer. See you there.